pleasure to finally meet you. I mean, I obviously enjoyed reading your book, I think a while ago before deciding on translating that book. But I came across, actually, I was embarrassed to admit that I came to know you because of the evolution textbook that with the Bergstrom, Dugatkin textbook.
There's nothing to be embarrassed about.
So during my PhD, my advisor actually used that to teach evolution, and I was the TA for that course. I used to use that book, and I still do now that I've actually moved to my country. It's a great textbook.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, but I was wondering, because later I came across your books, which were just much more like covering a wider topics, especially the history of science. And,
yes.
And I was pretty interested before. I was interested in the history of Soviet science, because I had read a few things about like Vavilov and the genetics, like the infamous genetics congress in like 1937, I think, which was supposed to take place in USSR, but then it just fell apart because of the, like, Lysenko was at the time in Soviet Union reigning supreme. But I didn't know anything about the Fox experiment, which is kind of this magical experiment that is kind of, it's almost insane how someone would think of an experiment like this. I was wondering how because you wrote Prince of Evolution about Kropotkin, which is also like the Russian connection there. How did you come across the Fox experiment, and what really captured your imagination and really made you write a book about this fascinating experiment?
Sure, that's a great question. Before I answer that, let me just tell you just a quick little fun story, which is that, I also am quite interested in Vavilov. And for what it's worth, he was one of Belyayev, who's the person who started the Fox experiment. He was one of Belayev's idols. And so Belyayev often looked to Vavilov's ideas. Now, in terms of how I came to the Fox experiment, like you, I mean, I studied evolution, and I'm an evolutionary biologist. And so I had come across, an article here or there over the years. I don't remember exactly where I would have first come across it, but I'm sure that in one of my evolution classes, one of the professors probably mentioned it. So I knew a little bit, I knew sort of the basics, that there was this experiment going on, and they had these foxes with curly tails and flapping ears and all that. But that was long ago. And back in about 2010, I was basically searching for a new history of science book. So I had gotten very interested in writing history of science work in the mid-2000s, and I was at a point where I really was looking for a next project. And so, I started thinking about the foxes, and because, like you had mentioned, I had done some other work on Soviet biology and evolution. I knew something about Lysenko and what was going on in the Soviet Union at that time. And I began to think, that must have had some impact on this Fox experiment, because Lysenko was still very much in power when the Fox experiment began. So I started thinking about that, and then I started realizing, when you're writing a history of science book, especially for like the general audience, people who would pick it up in a bookstore, there are certain things that you really want in it to grab people in so that they'll read science. And one, of course, is great science, which the Fox experiment I knew had, and I knew there was a lot more that I didn't know about that was out there that was probably published in Russian. It had this interesting potential political ramification connection. And then, of course, everybody loves dogs, and everybody is interested in how domestication of dogs happened over long periods of time. So I thought, oh, this is really something that might be interesting to write about. So I have to admit it was rather sort of maybe an overly bold move, but I just wrote Lyudmila Trut, my co-author, I just wrote her out of the blue. And I just wrote her an email and I thought, I hope she understands English. And I just said, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I'm a historian of science. I would love to chat with you about the possibility of trying to tell this, the story of this experiment to a really broad audience. And she wrote back, to my surprise, very quickly and said that she had long been interested in doing something like this. She had been approached by other people in the past, but she didn't really, they weren't right. And she thought, given sort of what I had done so far, maybe we could talk. So we began a dialogue on email. Her English is good enough on email that we could exchange we could exchange emails as long as they didn't get too complex. We did that for a while. We decided that we would try together to write this book. And that was about 2010 or 2011. And I'll just tell you one more quick story because this is a long answer to a short question. And you can stop me anytime you want. But one last bit to this was that we exchanged lots of emails, and I brought in a friend of mine who was fluent in Russian, and we could then do much more complex, subtle exchanges on email. The sort of thing where it really matters, the nuances of the word really matter. And that was going fine, but the problem was that Lyudmila would tell me anything I wanted to know about the science, which was great because there's so much that I didn't know. But anytime I sort of began talking about Lysenko, or anytime I asked her about the everyday parts of the experiment, what was it like? What are the people who are the people that feed the foxes? What's a regular day like? She would quickly pull back. She would say, we don't really talk about the politics, and I don't really think the everyday stuff is all that interesting. And I tried to explain to her that I understand what you're saying, but if you want to reach a very broad audience, we need this. This is the story that will make people turn the pages so that they learn the science. She was still, sort of reluctant. And then I realized this was my fault, that this was a person who, at the time, she was in her early 80s. Now she's going to be 87. And this is someone who grew up in Stalinist Russia. And it's fine to talk to other people about science, but the politics and the sort of everyday things, that's something you talk about with people you're comfortable with. And we were comfortable as colleagues, but not more than that. So I thought, I need to go there. And I need to spend time with Lyudmila. I need to spend time with everybody who's involved with the experiment. I need to meet the foxes. And I did that in 2012 for the first time, and that changed everything. All of a sudden, I couldn't get Lyudmila to stop talking to me about this stuff. So there you go. That's how how the book developed.
So there's a fascinating, like the Lysenko stuff is quite fascinating to me because you have Vavilov also had a tragic life, really, given he was an accomplished evolutionary biologist and geneticist, and he was recognized, but that wasn't enough to shield him from Lysenko at the time. Yeah. And yes. Dmitry also, who started the fox experiment, that is also fascinating because you have this clandestine operation starting in a milieu where they're actually not accepting this kind yes. of, like what they describe as reactionary science, right? This kind of, because everything is seen through the lens of politics and communism at the time, it was considered to
Right.
be kind of a traditional reactionary science that is and they wanted to have their own science, right? And I was wondering, like you wrote about Kropotkin, of course that was before Soviet Union, but doing research about Dmitry and Lysenko, how does it fit in with the way you think science progresses actually? Because I was fascinated by, because when we think of how science moves forward, there are like different ways of looking at it. And if you look at like the like paradigm shift ideas and stuff like that, and here you have like a clandestine research program actually being conducted while the overall scientific apparatus is not really accepting of it. And how
Yes.
did it fall apart? Because that's always fascinating to me, that Lysenko is dominant and then he is no longer really, even though he exists and is still present, he's no longer accepted, even though, I mean, a decade or two before, he was really making people disappear. Right?
Right.
How do you explain that? Like how, like as someone who is interested in the history of science and the history of like evolutionary biology, like
Right.
what can we learn from this this progress or this change in a very short period of time in Soviet like science or genetics?
Right. Well, that's a big question.
Probably people have written books on that, and I think people will write books on this topic,
yes.
right?
Well, so in fact, just, there are a couple of books on this, and there's a wonderful one by a guy by the name of Larry Soyfer, Soyfer, all about Lysenkoism.
Yes. That.
Okay, yeah. So I guess there are a couple of parts to what you were asking. First, in terms of how Lysenko eventually disappeared from being the danger that he was, I think there were a lot of things at play. I think perhaps the most important one was that eventually, even the Soviet authorities began to realize he was just making things up, and that what he was saying was not going to work. And part of the reason that he rose to such a high level of power in the Soviet Union, I mean, this man dominated genetics and to some extent medical science as well, by basically making this argument that he and his ideas could solve the starvation issues that the Soviet Union was facing with various crops. And he was able to basically fool people for quite a long time. And then once he rose to power, it was harder to pull him out. But eventually, even the authorities began to realize that what he said was just made up. It wasn't working. Then there, of course, were changes in the sense that he was Stalin's right-hand man on science, and when Stalin was gone, some of his power base was also gone. And in fact, we tell this story in the book that Lysenko was still not in power, not quite as powerful, but still in power when the Fox experiment began. And Khrushchev was now in charge of the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev came to visit the big science center where the Fox experiment was taking place, this place called Akademgordak in Siberia. And he was still somewhat under Lysenko's spell, but his daughter was a journalist who was much more westernized in her education, and she knew that Lysenko was a fraud. And she helped convince her father that that was the case. And then other people, Nobel Prize winning scientists within the Soviet Union, began to speak out against him. And that really caused him to lose power. But that said, that was, I don't know, 63, 64 is pretty much when he just completely left, faded from the radar. But it really took another decade or a decade and a half before the Soviet government admitted what a mistake it was. And so that took time. Now, in terms of the way that we can think about how science progresses, and what Lysenko can teach us about that, I think, I'm always a little bit leery of, prognosticating and predicting the future based on these sorts of things. I think we've gotten better, generally, in terms of not letting something like Lysenkoism rise again, just anywhere. That said, I really think there are things that we need to pay attention to. And the largest one is this notion that politicians use and manipulate science. Well, politicians use scientists in a way that's completely inappropriate. So in Lysenko's case, he wanted that. He desperately wanted Stalin and others to recognize him. But even today, if you think about things like global warming, we have politicians in the United States who are basically ignoring huge amounts of data, but they're able to find one or two or three or so people who have a PhD at the end of their name, who will tell them what they want to hear because economically and politically it's better for them. And they raise those people up to high positions in the government. It's nothing like what happened in terms of magnitude with Lysenko, in terms of people being fired and being thrown in prison. But there are similarities in the sense of the whole process that we really, really have to be careful of having politicians and people in power do this sort of thing. To a lesser extent, it still goes on with just evolution in general. You can find politicians who will find a creation scientist with a PhD at the end of their name and say, you see, really, there's still a lot of debate going on about this. So I think, Lysenko is sort of the worst case scenario in the last 100 years. But, we need to keep our guard up because it could certainly happen again. I don't know exactly where, but it could.
Yeah, but I agree that I'm just predicting or trying to find cause from the past is kind of misguided a bit, because there's just, you're looking at an experiment with a one replication, right? And you're like, okay, like this one trajectory is like this. So can we make causal inferences from that? And that can lead to the catastrophic miscalculations and predictions. I was wondering, because you went to the fox farm, and you went there and you saw I think because a lot of the foxes, as you described in the book, actually died, or just because of the troubles they had after the fall of the Soviet Union, right? And the fundings and everything was kind of short. But you, presumably they still have foxes, because I know that they also are selling them as pets, and you can adopt them, right? Which is very touching stories at the end of the book about people actually adopting. I was wondering, because first of all, how are the foxes right now? Like given in reality, because I've seen clips of them, and they're not dogs, right? They haven't been converted into dogs, but I mean, you don't expect one species to suddenly become another species based on like 50 or so years of artificial selection. But how much, in your personal experience, how was the result of the artificial selection on the behavior?
Sure. And let me just say that, there was a period in the early 90s where they had a lot of financial problems, and the population, before that, the population was of domesticated foxes was, 300, 400, 500 foxes generally. Then, because they didn't have a lot of money, the population went down to, the hundreds rather than multiple hundreds. But it never went down low enough that was really a problem for inbreeding and that sort of thing. So there was a period where they basically just had to keep things going until things got better. And things got better again in the late 90s. And since then, the population of domesticated foxes has been very high, 300, 400, 500 foxes. If you go there today, the experiment still goes on and there are still that many foxes. My personal experience, I know people have said, I've seen the videos on YouTube and I've seen pictures and they really look like and act like dogs. It's astonishing when you're there holding one of these animals in your arms. Those videos don't do justice to how calm they are, how dog-like they are. Of course, you're right. You can't, you can't evolve foxes into dogs. Dogs have their own evolutionary trajectory, but you have animals that are incredibly dog-like. The kind of dog that sits in your lap and just is there for you as a friend. So basically, when I was there, they gave, some of those foxes, I held them in my arms, and I will tell you within 5 seconds, they were licking my face and nipping at my ears friendly. And all of this, this is not something they've learned or been trained to do. This is what the selection experiment has produced. They also look so dog-like. I mean, they're about the size of kind of like a medium-sized dog. So I can't think, their weight is about maybe 50 pounds, and I'm not making the kilogram conversion in my head, but around 50 pounds. And their fur is beautiful. I was there intentionally in the winter where they have their very thick fur coat. So it was January, and it's just gorgeous. And many of them, I mean, there's a lot of variation, but many of them have this beautiful black and silver coloration. They do have these curly tails. They have, their faces are, instead of a fox that you imagine in the wild with a very pointed snout, their faces are much rounder and dog-like. So they look and they act incredibly dog-like, and they are just as friendly as you can imagine. I mean, it was just breathtaking to see these animals. And when you go up, the farm is big, and they're in a certain area, and when you're approaching them, they're in these sheds, and each shed has maybe 50 or so housing units. Each of them has a fox in it. If you are within 100 meters of that shed and they see you coming, they just go crazy. They are so excited that humans are approaching them. And it's not only because humans feed them, it's because they just, I'm an animal behaviorist, and I'm very careful about kind of using human emotions to explain animals, but there is no other way to describe these animals except that they live to interact with humans. This is what makes them happy. And so it's remarkable. I mean, the experiment, worked, and it worked faster and more dramatically than Belyayev expected, that Lyudmila Trut expected. And it's still going on. They're in year 60 or 61, depending exactly how you count. Each year, the foxes produce the next generation, so that's 60 generations. It's remarkable what they've accomplished in 60 generations. It's the equivalent of the kind of change that might happen in 6,000 generations in nature. So it's just incredible. I mean, the videos are wonderful that you see on YouTube, and they're accurate, but they just don't do justice to how amazing the animals are, and how amazing Lyudmila is, and everybody who's involved in the experiment.
When you describe Dmitry, I mean, he comes across as I mean, I love the book because it's like a novel, right? The fact that it's real is a bonus to me, because the characters are pretty well characterized, and Dmitry is a fascinating character because he was he obviously was a very patriotic person, even I mean, when he was
Yes.
combating like cancer late in his life. I mean, you described vividly when he
Right.
like people are trying to celebrate the victory day, the victory, the patriotic war as they describe it in
Right.
Russia. But also the continuity of his thought, because early on when you describe the experiments, it's allusion to Darwin's variation under domestication, and like how Darwin was thinking about how, like, what is domestication really, right? And I was wondering, first of all, how how Dmitry's thoughts were formed actually in this line, because I mean, very like with the description about his like early childhood and like his early education, one wonders how he came across this very specific question. And also the fact that in more broad terms, how this experiment, because in the last 20 or 30 years, you have the experimental evolution giving new life to old questions, right? About the contingency and necessity in evolution, things that were purely theoretical up until you had actual evolving populations. In this respect, the foxes are pretty amazing because the behaviors are changing, not just the mutations about like glucose consumption. Like these are not very like metabolic like changes in a bacterium. It's a change in the behavior and the facial features, right? So what was the origins of Dmitry's thought, and also what are the ramifications of these experiments for the evolutionary questions we have about what trajectories life actually takes?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of how he came to these ideas, you know, we talk a little bit in the book where his older brother was a geneticist, and so even when he was 10 and 11 and 12 years old, his older brother would bring geneticists together in their home, and they would have these shouting meetings that they would call, where they would just debate all of these issues in genetics. So this is a kid, you know, when he was young, he was exposed a lot to this. And so when he was the equivalent of an undergraduate, he went to an agricultural school where he was exposed to all sorts of domesticated species, right? You know, goats and sheep and so on. And he was also, they also were very, very good at that point about teaching genetics, because before Lysenko became a force, the Soviet Union was a major, major area where genetics was done. People went from all over the world to study in the Soviet Union. So Belyayev had that sort of background. Then he goes off after, when he's an undergraduate, and he fights in World War II, and he actually, you know, gets medals for bravery. He's a very brave person. And he comes back and he gets a job based on his undergraduate work at an institute of fur breeding in Moscow. And there is where he begins to interact a lot with the foxes, because of course they're interested in breeding foxes for their furs. And when he's doing that, he's beginning to notice certain strange things in the foxes that he's studying, strange from a genetic perspective, things that hadn't appeared for long periods of time began to reappear in some of the populations of foxes that he was working with. And he began to think about the underlying genetics. And he, you know, he had been exposed to Darwin's work on domestication. And when he was studying his foxes, you know, he couldn't help but start thinking, comparing them to what he had seen in just dogs all over, you know, as he had grown up and at that point. And he began then to think a little bit more about this process of genetics and domestication. And when he did, you know, I think, I don't have it, but I know that there's this kind of memorial room in Belayev's honor in Siberia at the Institute of Cytology and Genetics. I believe that it's in there that they have his annotated copy of Darwin's book on domestication, where you can kind of see his notes along the side of it. And so he's all of these things are happening, and then at some point, and it's always sort of difficult to say exactly what that point was, but at some point he began to think the one thing that united all domesticated species was that as humans were domesticating them, whatever we were domesticating them for, in some cases it would have been for protection, in other cases it would have been for food, in other cases, food in terms of meat or eggs and chickens or whatever it might be, or milk. But the one thing, or transportation, like in horses, whatever we were domesticating them for, the one thing that our ancestors had to have were animals that were not going to try to kill them while they were being in the process of domestication. So they had to choose the animals right at the start that were the least aggressive and perhaps the most friendly towards humans. And that was sort of the one underlying theme that was driving him. And so he decided to test that. And that's how the idea for the fox experiment began. His idea was he would do an evolution selection experiment, and the only thing he would do was choose the calmest, tamest animals. And that is the only thing they ever choose on to this day. But all of those other changes that we talked about, the face and the tail and the fur and the hormone levels, all of that is the result of choosing only for the calmest, tamest animals. So this idea has sort of revolutionized the way that we think about the process of domestication. And it is sort of the reigning paradigm for how we think about animal domestication. And of course, we've made a lot of progress since Belyayev first thought of these ideas. But I will say that when you read his early work, I had that translated. So ideas that were that he was thinking about even 10 years, 15 years before the experiment began. It's really astonishing that this man was so ahead of his time. A lot of the ideas today, we would call them evolution and development ideas, evo-devo ideas, they're called. But there was no field of that. There was no area of study really on that at Belayev's time when he was coming up with these ideas. And so you read his ideas and you can see this guy who's so far ahead, and yet, there aren't the words. There isn't an area of study with a whole set of terms that you can use, and you're reading him and you're like, oh, what he's really saying is this, but nobody, that term didn't exist at that point. So it was fascinating. Like I say, it's made us rethink how this process of domestication occurred.
I mean, aside from the scientific points made in the book, there's like one of the fascinating parts is the interaction between humans and animals, right? And in the book, you actually drive that point home with discussing like the prehistoric interactions between animals and peoples, and how like how we know that people used to live alongside animals, and they would treasure them as far as even burying them with their owners, right? And then you have the fox experiment, which is scientific, but then that was the most probably heartbreaking part of translating this book, was all the plot about Pushinka and how that result. And I actually remembering that chapter and how it ends. I'm getting a bit emotional. At the time when I translated that final chapter, I was actually put aside the book for a week because I was so traumatized by how that changed.
Oh my goodness.
Right? Because it is fascinating that, I mean, it is a question, a scientific question, an evolutionary question, but also reflecting the fact that like there is real, I mean, you can imagine animals like having thoughts, which is, I mean, most of the time it's kind of anthropomorphizing animals, right?
Right.
But in this case, it seemed as I mean, you firsthand, I mean, and anyone who has interacted with dogs knows that, like, I mean, there is real affection to a certain extent. And in the case of Poshenka, that was devastating. I mean, how that story unfolds. And I was wondering, like, how you see that, because do you think it is a reflection that we can be more in harmony with? I mean, not in a sort of metaphysical sense, but more in harmony in a way that, like all the other animals, we have like a shared history as
Yes.
on the tree of evolution, right? And we can coexist to a certain extent. We can even sympathize with them, right? And
Yes.
these are instances where you can see it. I mean, they're limited to domesticated organisms for the most part. How do you think that, is it really important? Is that a lesson to be drawn from these interactions, that we can actually be a bit more more selfless as a species when interacting with the nature that surrounds us?
I think it is. I think it is. And I think, you know, people are beginning to realize that. So, you know, I know here there are all sorts of programs that have been developed in hospitals and various other places where people are really sick and you know, things are not looking good. You bring in a dog, a little puppy, and everything changes. All of a sudden, people who are, you know, very, very sick, they have something they can love. They you know, we have developed this. We have, you know, developed over thousands of years this relationship with domesticated animals, right? Mostly domesticated animals, but nonetheless, it demonstrates how possible it is for us to have these very, very strong feelings for other forms of life. You know, the story that you had mentioned with Pushinka, who is a fox that we talk a lot about in the book, and it's a great example of this kind of bond that forms between Lyudmila and some of the animals in the experiment. I remember just, so you know, you say you put the book away for a week. I remember distinctly sitting down in Lyudmila's office with her and having her tell me this story. And so that was in about 2012. So that would have been 37 years or 38 years after the Pushinka story happened. She still broke down in tears thinking about it. You know, Pushinka came to this tragic end. She lived in this house with a fox and with a family of these domesticated foxes. And the thing is, you know, the fox experiment is all about the science, but Lyudmila realized that really the only, so, you know, you could measure all this stuff about the animals, right? And you could come up with these, and they have these very complicated behavioral tests. Are they getting friendlier? You know, so you give, okay. But she thought, you know, the only way we really know is if I live with some of them. And it wasn't officially part of the experiment in the sense that you'll never see any of that Pushinka story and things like that published outside of the book. I mean, no, it wasn't published in a science journal, but she lived with this family of foxes in a small little house on the experimental fox farm for more than a year. And she wanted to know, okay, so what is it like? I mean, you know, do these animals truly behave like our domesticated pets, like dogs? And the answer was absolutely. I mean, more than she even dreamed of. But more importantly, was not so much that she was able to sort of answer that question for herself, but the bond that she formed with these animals was so deep. I mean, it was, you know, these were like your most beloved dogs to her. And it took, you know, it took no time for that to happen. And it happened in a person, Lyudmila, who at the time, you know, she was a hardcore geneticist. I mean, you know, this was all about the genetics, right? But even someone who was coming at it that way could not help but fall in love with these animals, which tells you, you know, how deep this bond is. And I would argue how much over thousands of years we have co-evolved this kind of emotional link to our, in particular, our domesticated animals, because they were so important to us. And so, you know, the more ways that they could relate to us and we could relate to them, the better. And maybe a lot of that was driven by practicality, like it makes an horse easier to ride, or it makes a dog better at protecting me. Whatever was the underlying driving force, the way it worked is, you know, we had to view them in a different way. Our psyche had to change and not think of them as wild, dangerous things, but as other organisms that we could have emotional links to. I think, you know, the hard part is to sort of expand that beyond just domesticated species. And you know, that's not going to be an easy thing. But I think, you know, I think that at least we're moving in the right direction. Let me just say one quick thing to you. I have, at 10 my time, I have to go and do another call, if that's okay.
No, that is fine, actually.
Yeah. I mean, I'm enjoying this, and we can continue it at another time if it's helpful. But I just so you know.
Yeah, but I think that this has been pretty great. But I just a comment. I like that human story about like the Lyudmila and Dmitry and Persian and everyone involved, all the scientists, because there's there's a poem by Wordsworth, The Tables Turned, which has like, it's all about the meddling intellect, but then it has a verse which I really find troubling, which is to dissect we murder, which is like the whole point of like, oh, there is like the scientific intellectual way of looking is kind of heartless. But yeah, by telling the story of people who did the science, you really show that, okay, these are people, flesh and blood, and they cannot really scientifically, in the sense of like devoid of emotion, trying to investigate the subject matter, in this case the foxes, and they actually fall in love with them. They are even though they are studying and they are measuring everything about them.
Yes. Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, it's really amazing, and you talk to the people involved in the experiment, and you sense that so deeply. I mean, you know, the experiment is very, very well controlled, and it's done the way you want an experiment to be done. That doesn't mean that they don't have deep emotional ties to, and they know it. They know that they have essentially created a new pet. And in fact, the last thing I'll say here is just that Belyayev had actually long wanted to write a book for a general audience about the foxes. He died in '85, and that was one of the things that he had hoped and dreamt of doing that he didn't do. Most of the things he hoped and dreamt of doing, he did do, but he died early, young. But he had thought about writing this kind of book, and he even had a name for it. And the name for it was "Man is Making a New Friend." And that's real. And the people who do the experiment, no matter how well controlled the science is and how good they are about that, they know that they have a responsibility here, that they've created a new kind of animal that we are going to have deep emotional bonds to, and they're very aware of that.